When evangelicals talk about the nuclear family, they believe they're referring to a timeless, immutable standard that was established in the book of Genesis. That is false. They are talking about a cultural phenomenon that largely arose in the 1950s in the United States, in the Western world. And it was something that was mostly practiced by heterosexual couples who were middle class or upper middle class and were white, who could afford for the woman to stay home, who believed that the woman could be submissive, that allowed the man to be seen as the unquestioned leader of his submissive wife and his placated children, who were built around the idea of home ownership, who didn't live with their grandparents or their aunts and uncles. And frankly, this is not a form of family that was ever popular before that moment. And even at that moment was only popular in certain parts of the world. But it was created as a default. Now, if you go back to the Bible and you say, okay, the nuclear family, which is not a generational household, it is only the immediate family. Everybody else lives somewhere else. It doesn't involve those members. They are not part of the nuclear family. The nuclear family doesn't include Aunt Janie, who doesn't have any other relatives, right? In years past, she was a part of the family. You had to care for her because you shared blood. Grandma lived with you. We didn't have nursing homes in the 1600s like we do now. She lived with you. She was a part of the family. And guess what? We all worked. There wasn't a provider because he had a penis. Everybody worked. Mom was working, dad was working, 12-year-old kids were working. It was all hands on deck in order to run a household. Read what David Brooks said about the spectacular failure of the nuclear family in the cover story of the Atlantic magazine just this year. It has disconnected us in ways that we never predicted. It has created burdens on individual members of that household, and we've put Jesus wallpaper over it. When people say that, I ask them, can you name for me an example of a nuclear family that you think is a good model in the text? Is it Abram, who prostituted out his slave so that he could have his first child, and it was blessed by God? Is it Jacob? Is it the polygamous relationships that were prescribed by God and blessed by God in the Old Testament? Is it the hundreds of concubines that were a part of the immediate family of King Solomon? Is it the prophet Hosea, who marries a prostitute? Is it Moses, who ends up in an interreligious marriage? Is it the single Jesus or the likely single Apostle Paul? Is it any of the writers of the epistles who abandoned their families, abandoned their children, and abandoned their wives so that they could go on missionary journeys where they died and never came home? It's interesting that when people talk about the biblical model for the traditional family, they can't actually name a model that exists within that Bible. And I think that prompts us. If we believe that the Bible is the central text for guiding the way that we think and the way that we practice our faith, that if we cannot name one single model of what a biblical family looks like, then maybe that model isn't actually biblical at all.